Hello, and thank you for joining us. We're excited to have this conversation with you. My name is Laura McGowan Robinson, and I thank you for joining the Diversity and Leadership Institute, Association of California School Administrators, and the Center for Powerful Schools in this three-part series entitled Lunch and Learn, the Black Teacher and Leader Pipeline. I'm your moderator for the day, Laura McGowan Robinson, the CEO of Diversity and Leadership Institute. And we're excited to have you all here. Some of you are joining us via Facebook or YouTube, and we invite you to share your name and where you're joining us from and the organization that you're representing. Throughout our time today, we'll encourage you to interact with us, sharing your questions or comments in the thread. While we're not physically in the same room, we can create a virtual environment where we can learn from each other. So share your thoughts, comments, and questions. And this is a lunch and learn. So feel free to enjoy your lunch while we are having this conversation. So I want to just take a quick look at our comments. Again, tell us who you are, your name, the organization you're with. I want to give you a shout out and welcome you to our conversation. So don't be shy. I see a couple of likes coming in. So thank you for liking. And if you are joining us, I invite you to share this link with your colleagues. While they're enjoying their lunch, they may not know that this conversation is happening. So I invite you to share it across your social media platforms as well. So I will go ahead and get us started. So we're pleased to bring forth this important conversation with our partners at AXA and the Center for Powerful Schools. To begin our roundtable, I would like to start by sharing a bit about the Diversity and Leadership Institute, or DLI. The Diversity and Leadership Institute was founded to address the chronic lack of racial diversity, particularly among Black and Latinx leaders in California. At DLI, we believe that racial diversity and culturally responsive leadership is critical to improving both educational and school climate outcomes for Black and Latinx students. The mission of the Diversity and Leadership Institute is to create equitable outcomes for Black and Latinx students by building a movement of racially diverse and culturally responsive public education leaders. Today, and for the next 2 consecutive Mondays, we'll look at 3 different aspects of the Black teacher and leader pipeline in public K-12 education. I'll share our rationale with you. It's undeniable that there continues to be equity gaps between Black students and their white counterparts. And while there are various strategies to close or eliminate these gaps, there's a body of research on the impact that Black teachers have on the achievement of Black students. The research findings include Black students who have Black teachers are persistent in accomplishing schoolwork and are more engaged in and out of the classroom and are more likely to graduate high school and more likely to enroll in college. The goals for our conversation today: we will explore these conditions through the series of the roundtable discussions among educational leaders, policymakers, and researchers to discuss solutions to address the Black educator pipeline. Our goal is to ultimately develop a working group that will develop a strategy to tackle this issue, increasing the number of Black educators across the state of California, and develop a sustained Black teacher and leader pipeline. Toward the end of the presentation and via email, we will share a link to an interest form for those interested in participating in the working group. Our objective for today is to dive deeply into the current research on Black educators and their impact on Black student outcomes from several perspectives: national, statewide, research on teacher and administrator preparation programs, the issues of equity and access, as well as retention and recruitment of Black educators. We'll also, in subsequent conversations on November 2nd, look at the institutions of higher education preparation program leaders as they discuss successes, challenges, and opportunities within the African American teacher and leader pipeline. And that again will be on Monday from 11:30 to 1. The third of the series will be on November 9th, again at 11:30 to 1, where we'll be talking to education leaders where they will discuss their successes and challenges as it relates to recruiting and retaining African American teachers and leaders. Again, we invite our guests to bring your lunch and share your questions via Facebook Live or YouTube Live, and we'll have a Q&A after we hear from our researchers today. Again, even during the conversation, I welcome you to share your comments and questions. We want to hear you. We want to know what you're thinking about the discussion. So please keep them coming in throughout our time together. So I want to shout out some of the folks who've already joined us. Alicia says, good morning. She's calling us from Lancaster School District. We have Mike Davis from Lancaster. We have Claire from Partnership of LA Public Schools, LA Schools. We have Damon Johnson from Excel in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Thank you for joining us. Anna Marie is here from UCLA. Thank you for joining us. And so many others. We have Natasha from LMU TFA. So shout out to one of our panelists here who is joining us from the School of Education, Dr. Young, and from our UCLA colleague who is joining us in the conversation today, Dr. Orange. Again, keep them coming in. We want to hear from you. Thank you so much. And I will begin by introducing our esteemed panelists today. I'll start by introducing Ms. Desiree Carver-Thomas. She's a researcher and policy analyst at the Learning Policy Institute, LPI. Her research is focused on equity with regard to educator quality issues, including teacher supply and demand, teacher diversity, and school and district leader preparation development. She is the author of Diversifying the Teaching Profession, How to Recruit and Retain Teachers of Color, and lead author of Teacher Turnover, Why It Matters and What We Can Do About It. She's also a former New York City public school teacher, and she studied public policy at UC Berkeley. We also have joining us Abby Ridley Kerr. Abby Ridley Kerr is a researcher in data analysis at the Education Trust West. She has a background in community-oriented research and data analysis. She earned her master's degree in public policy from UC Berkeley's Goldman School of Public Policy. Abby helps lead the educator diversity and digital divide at Education Trust West. Next up, we have Dr. Michelle D. Young, PhD, is the new School of Education Dean at Loyola Marymount University. She's also the president of the National Policy Board for Educational Administration and a 2021 Impact Fellow with Deans for Impact. Throughout her career, she's developed and sustained a reputation as an innovative, civic-minded, ethical leader with a strong commitment to diversity and social justice. Equity improvement and capacity development have been central to Young's work as a researcher and an organizational leader. From efforts to diversify the educational leadership professorate and the School of Leadership pipeline, mentoring programs, policy initiatives, and research projects, to developing a diverse board of directors for UCEA, she searched for and found new opportunities for impact and growth. She has co-edited and co-authored 6 books and has published more than 100 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. Her scholarship focuses on how university programs, educational policies, and school leaders can support equitable and quality experiences for all students and adults who learn and work in schools. She is currently editing a special issue of Leadership and Policy in Schools focused on developing a diverse leadership pipeline. Young has received several honors and awards for her scholarship, including Bridges Award for significant contributions to theory, research, and practice in education leadership preparation. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Orange, who serves as the director for the Culture and Equity Project, CEP, and is assistant director for the Principal Leadership Institute, PLI, at UCLA Center X. Her commitment to education spans over 20 years. Her work focuses on supporting educators on the implementation of culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy. She is one of the developers of the Reciprocal Learning Partnerships for Equity Coaching framework, which provides educators with a process to interrogate practices that reproduce inequity in educational spaces. As a director for CEP and assistant director for PLI, Her work focuses on preparing the next generation of social justice leaders to transform and create equitable and culturally responsive educational spaces for all students. Prior to UCLA, she was a math and science teacher and principal of a K-8 school in Los Angeles that was specifically designed to serve standard English learners, SEL, and English language learners through culturally linguistic and responsive pedagogy. We are pleased to have all of our esteemed guests join us today. We have a very powerful panel prepared for you, and we're looking forward to some very robust and deep conversation. Again, I invite our panelists, as well as our virtual guests who are engaging in this roundtable, to send us your comments, send us your questions as we're moving through. We invite you to do that. So I would like to start just by giving you an overview of what each panelist will share from their research perspective to ground us. So we'll hear an overview of the data for Black educators from a national and statewide perspective, barriers to entry for Black educators. We hear about impact and benefits of Black educators on Black student outcomes specifically, and also best policies and practices for recruitment and retention of Black educators and leaders. So I'd like to start us with the national research on Black educators, with you specifically, Ms. Carver-Thomas. What are you seeing across the national landscape in terms of numbers of Black teachers given your scope of research? And also, what particular aspects are you focused on in your work?
Thank you for having me, and good morning. This is such an important topic, and I'm just honored to be able to be here with all of you this morning. I wanted to begin by reiterating some of what Dr. McGowan Robinson began with about the importance of Black educators. And there's a large body of research on the effects that teachers of color have on students, on student achievement and other outcomes, much of which shows substantial benefits to Black students when they have Black teachers. So for example, studies of Tennessee test data have found that Black elementary students with Black teachers had higher reading and math test scores than their peers. And these gains accumulate with each year that students had a Black teacher. And there are also long-term gains. K-3 students who had a Black teacher were less likely to drop out of high school and more likely to take a college entrance exam. And this is years after they had a Black teacher in elementary school. Similar data from North Carolina show long-term benefits. Black boys with at least one Black teacher in grades 3 to 5 were half as likely to drop out of high school, more likely to have college aspirations. And other studies using North Carolina data show similar outcomes. And like I said, there are these test score outcomes, but the benefits aren't just limited to test scores. North Carolina data show that Black students with Black teachers were less likely to be chronically absent or suspended or expelled. Research on implicit bias indicates that when young people have interactions with people from a variety of racial and ethnic backgrounds, they're less likely to hold implicit biases in adulthood. So it's important to emphasize that we don't just want teachers of color for students of color, but really a diverse teacher workforce for all of our students. And of course, hiring teachers of color isn't a cure-all. It's important that all teachers have the preparation and ongoing support to develop culturally responsive practices. And we shouldn't take for granted that teachers of color will enter with that knowledge. And even when teachers of color do have that proficiency, it's important that they aren't pigeonholed into particular roles. Black teachers express dissatisfaction with being expected to be the disciplinarian, for example, rather than recognized for their leadership potential or content expertise. So going back to the question about national data, we analyzed the most recent national data, and they show us that teachers of color make up a growing proportion of the educator workforce, 20% in 2015. However, this masks an alarming trend, which is that Black educators are actually in decline nationally. Black educators made up more than 8% of the educator workforce 30 years ago and are down to under 7% more recently. Meanwhile, more first-year teachers are Black than 30 years ago, 8% of first-year teachers compared to 4% 30 years ago. So how could it be that Black educators are coming into the profession more than ever, but they make up a declining share of the workforce. Well, teacher turnover is playing a major role. Teachers of color are more likely to enter teaching through an alternative pathway. In 2015, a quarter of teachers of color did so, which was double the share for white teachers. And this is even more common among Black teachers, nearly half of whom entered through these programs nationally. Teachers who enter the profession with little to no preparation turn over at rates 2 to 3 times as high as those who enter with the most comprehensive preparation. And as I mentioned, turnover is a driving factor for the decline of teachers of color in the workforce nationally. Of course, given the rising cost of higher education, it's no surprise that many teachers are entering through alternative pathways that are typically less expensive, but often provide less comprehensive preparation in coursework and clinically rich experiences. Debt burdens influence decisions about what career path to take, and this is especially true for Black college students who carry more debt and who are more likely to change their career paths because of their loans. Black teachers are also more likely to teach in schools serving more students of color and students from low-income families, which are often under-resourced schools leading that are contending with challenging teaching conditions as a result, which also leads to higher turnover rates. Teachers are more than twice as likely to move schools or leave teaching when they feel their administration isn't supportive. And for teachers of color in particular, higher turnover rates are associated with a lack of classroom autonomy and school influence. I know my colleague at Trust West, Abby, will talk about this, but here in California, 34% of teachers are teachers of color, which is higher than the national average of 20%. But 9% of California districts have no teachers of color, and 58% have fewer than 20% teachers of color, again, that national average. And while the state has a 12% turnover rate, Black teachers have the highest turnover rates at over 20% in a year. So given the role that teacher turnover plays in the trends that we're seeing, it's important that we not just recruit more Black teachers, but that we do so through high retention pathways like service scholarships and loan forgiveness programs, like teacher residencies, all of which I'm happy to talk about more.
Thank you so much, Desiree Carver-Thomas, for that really great context and really grounding us in what's happening nationally. I'd like to bring in, as you've already given us a bit of a teaser about what Abby Ridler-Kerr will be talking about today. So Ridley-Kerr, I'd like to bring you in, Abby, to share what we're seeing locally.
Wonderful. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. Go ahead to the next slide. So for those that aren't familiar with EdTrust West's work, we're a national nonprofit organization focused on educational equity, specifically racial equity, education justice, and closing achievement and opportunity gaps for California students through research, data, policy analysis, and advocacy. One of our key policy priorities is ensuring that California has a high-performing educator workforce that reflects the diversity of our state and students. California is one of the most diverse and vibrant school populations in the country, and yet, as we know, our teacher workforce is not reflective of that diversity. So today I'm going to share a bit more of the data on the pipeline of Black educators in California. But before we dive in, I wanted to start by framing the conversation with some voices from educators across the state that we've interviewed over the last year. We know that kids are going to have to consume in the air about their self-worth and their identity, and so anything we can do to help with a shield and tools to navigate society, we're going to do that. Next slide. I stay in the classroom because representation matters, and as a Black male, I understand the experiences of a largely marginalized and misunderstood fraction of the student body. As a Black student, I was often told I was unruly and had an attitude problem when I was just being a kid. I want to make sure other students don't have that same experience. Next slide. It wasn't until I entered college that I would have a Black male as a teacher educator, changing that experience for young Black men and for other folks who never get to see Black men as intelligent, caring, capable role models has been a huge reason why I entered and remain in the classroom. This is exactly why Black educators are so critically needed in California classrooms, but the reality is that our classrooms don't currently reflect the linguistic, cultural, and ethnic diversity of the state. Next slide. We know from the data that more than 250,000 students are in schools without a teacher of their same race. Like my colleague Desiree mentioned, 77% of students in California are students of color, and only 35% of teachers are teachers of color. And this means that there are over 100,000 students attending a school where every teacher is white. Next slide. When we look specifically at the data on Black teachers, we see similar trends. There are roughly 12,000 Black teachers in California, which is around 4% of the total teacher workforce. Around 1 in 20 students in California is Black, but more than half of schools don't have a Black teacher on campus, and more than 78,000 Black students attend a school with no Black teachers on staff. And these gaps persist across the teacher preparation pipeline in California. Only 5% of teacher candidates enrolled in California preparation programs are Black. Only 4% of first-year teachers in California are Black. We know from the research that Desiree cited that Black teachers and teachers of color are more likely to leave the profession. And we've estimated that at current rates, looking at an average rate of change, it would take at least 58 years to reach parity in teacher representation for Black students in California classrooms. Even though there's a long road ahead, we know that from the voices highlighted in the initial slides, that there are bright spots across the state of practices that work. I won't spend too much time here because I know my fellow panelists have rich research in this area, but I want to share more about a few places that EdTrust West has identified bright spots. Last year, our national office released a report in partnership with Teach Plus that examined why teachers of color leave the profession and identified solutions to disrupt that cycle, specifically creating culturally affirming school environments, affirming teachers' humanity and racial identity, empowering and investing in teachers, building a school-wide family, and making it a district priority to retain teachers of color. We at EdTrust West have identified 2 local California districts employing those practices to successfully retain Black educators and educators of color. The first is Compton Unified School District that is invested in a targeted male teacher of color retention effort, the Compton Male Teacher Network, and created a community of practice for male educators that responds to the unique needs of male teachers of color and affirms their racial identity. And Poway Unified School District, which has adopted a board resolution this summer affirming the importance of staff diversity and committing to the goal of hiring and retaining educators, administrators, and counselors of color. These examples are just a starting point, but serve as a building block to start disrupting the cycle and breaking down some of those systemic barriers that our Black educators face in California classrooms. Thank you so much, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Abby. I am now going to bring in Dean Young from Loyola Marymount School of Education to share with us from her research perspective. Dr. Young, you've covered racial diversity from the educational leadership perspective extensively. And from your research, what are you finding as it relates to Black educators and racial diversity more broadly from institutions of higher education from that perspective? And what are you seeing in regards to recruitment, selection, and retention?
Sure, happy to talk a little bit about those things, and so much appreciate the invitation to be with you all here today. I wanted to share in particular some of the recent findings from a project that I worked on with a team of researchers just prior to coming to LMU while I was still at UVA, in which we examined the leadership preparation programs across the country and their contributions to building a diverse pipeline. And I think that there are lessons learned from this study that are really important for whether it's districts, universities, states, or some sort of a federal initiative to really take on building a diverse pipeline of education leaders. And one of the first ones, Laura, is this issue of information. We have a real lack of information about what the principal pipeline actually looks like. For example, you know how the U.S. Department of Education collects and reports information on teacher preparation programs. They don't do that for principal preparation. There are no statistics that are collected through Title II, and many states also don't publicly disclose statistics on the number of individuals obtaining principal licensure and certification. So it's actually very difficult to get a really good estimate of the number of principals of color who are being developed and where they eventually are going to practice. So one thing we can say is just kind of because we have some federal databases that we can look at is that in general, an online program is much more likely to have a higher percentage of candidates of color, that there are states that seem to be better at preparing candidates of color. Texas is a good example. And then also universities that tend to be located within an urban area or near an urban area are a bit better, unless of course they have an online program. Then there seems to be some sort of a confluence there. Now, one of the second things that I think is really important for us to take into consideration here before we get to the actual program attributes is the whole leak in the pipeline. And both of our colleagues who have already spoken have given us a little bit of a glimpse of the teacher pipeline. And I would say that the largest loss of potential leaders of color actually occurs before college graduation. Relative to white and Asian peers, there's a substantially greater percentage of students of color who don't end up finishing college and who do not enter the schools of education. Now, after graduation from college and entry into the field of education as a teacher, as Dr. Carver Thomas and Abby Ridley were describing, this is another area where we have a significant kind of leak in the pipeline, where we have such significant percentage of individuals who are turning over once they're in the teaching profession. So the next section of the pipeline includes decisions that teachers make to obtain a principal's certificate and seek employment as a principals. Now, researchers have generally found that teachers of color are actually more likely than their white peers to seek and obtain a principal certification. Ed Fuller, in fact, found that the percentage of Black and Hispanic teachers obtaining principal certification was nearly double that of white teachers within the state of Texas. But Williams and Loeb found that Black teachers were more likely to obtain a principal certificate, but found that their odds of actually obtaining a position was lower as a principal. Now, that's not the case as an assistant principal. So there is a greater percentage of teachers of color that seek and obtain the certificate, but a higher percentage of them end up going into an assistant principalship rather than a principalship, and many do not move into the principalship. So then the final section of the pipeline is attrition from employment as assistant principal or principal. And similar to the teacher pipeline, there is significant turnover of the principal pipeline. In fact, by year 3, you've a new position or they've left the field entirely. And the percentage of by race is higher. Now, of course, that also presents opportunities, which we can talk about later. So then the third area that we looked at were the programs themselves. And it's important to think of the programs both in terms of their structures, but also in terms of their substance. And there are kind of 4 points within a preparation program where race matters. So one of them is in terms of marketing, recruitment, and admissions. A second is learning designs and platforms. The third is how programs retain students. And then the fourth is around what programs do post-graduation to help with placement. Now, the paralleling those those 4 areas are what the substance of those different stages look like, and whether or not there is an intentionality, and I think this is very important, an intentionality around building a diverse pipeline. And there are a number of programs that have this as a key intention. And we find that in those programs, the marketing, recruitment, and admissions is typically done in partnership with districts. It's typically done with a reflection of the types of practices that seem to be discriminatory towards people of color, such as the use of GREs, GPAs, and not using things like interviews and so forth. In terms of marketing, working with a district is much more likely to end up with a more diverse pipeline, because districts are also committed to having a more diverse workforce in general, particularly districts that have a high proportion of students of color. This also enhances the type of learning opportunities that are provided, because districts are looking for individuals who can engage in culturally responsive and reflect the demographics of their school populations. In terms of learning designs and delivery, we see that the universities that are more successful tend to be those that are also offering online, hybrid, and then kind of executive model and hybrid types of delivery. And then retention, we find that those programs that are more successful tend to have cohorts. They also tend to have smaller class sizes, and then they build into their programs not just opportunities for placement after graduation, placement assistance, but also they put in place network opportunities so that alumni have a strong network of colleagues that they can call on and engage with.
Thank you so much, Dr. Young, for sharing that deep perspective. Both depth and breadth were covered. And as you were talking, and as I was listening, I thought that would be a perfect segue for Dr. Orange to come in and share, given what she's doing at UCLA Center X, as well as her equity work. And so I want to bring you in, Dr. Orange, as your work is at the intersection of equity and educational leadership. And from your research and practitioner lens, I'm sure that your colleagues that you've heard so far have set a really firm foundation. What are you seeing as it relates to equity, access, and retention in the Black teacher and leader pipeline, specifically in your work?
Okay, well, thanks so much. I am going to kind of drill down a little bit and talk about what is taking place at the practitioner level, because everyone did such a wonderful job of laying the groundwork about what the research says and already started to distinguish some possibilities and the challenges that we all face with this. I think I'm fortunate. I happen to work in Center X, at UCLA, where the Teacher Ed program and the Principal Leadership Institute are both housed. And the mission and vision of those programs, they intentionally, and have done this since their inception, focused on the retention, the recruitment of teachers and principals of color. And I believe, as Dr. Young had stated, that the intentionality behind these preparation programs are very important. So if you say that this is your mission to recruit, retain, and think about what happens before they enter the programs, what happens during, and what happens after, then you have to shift what you actually do to make sure that that happens. And so these have been intentional spaces to make sure that we're really centering students of color and Black students particularly in these programs. We've recognized over the years that there has been a decrease in all of that in the programs, the Teacher Ed program and the administrative credential program due to the demographic shifts and that were just noted by the other researchers before. And again, part of it is for us to think about as programs, what do we need to do to make sure that we ensure the diversity of thought that goes out into the field and the diversity of candidates that we have come into our program. Um, part of the thinking, what I really want to highlight is what we've learned from our own candidates. The majority of the candidates that sit inside of the Principal Leadership Institute and the Teacher Ed program inside of UCLA Center X are teachers of color. So we were able and are able consistently to have like rich conversations and understand what does it feel like in present time for them to be here, to go through the program and what happens in the field, right? So one of the things that Dr. Young mentioned was just some of the barriers of entering into these institutions and the programs, and the elimination of the GRE, thinking about grades, the feeling that they feel when they enter programs really impact whether they stay, which programs they actually want to enter, whether it's these online programs versus programs that are in person, they impact them a great deal. We're fortunate because, again, the GRE has not been a factor, and thinking about grades, we've shifted the way we think about things, and it as far as them entering into the program, and it has shifted the way Black principals or future candidates to be principals have decided to come into the program, and they want to be in a space because they're already feeling pressure from white institutions around what does this GRE mean? What do the grades mean? Can I even compete in these institutions? And so those barriers are very important to eliminate. Money, of course, has always been a factor and continues to be a factor. And so again, thinking back to Dr. Young, if we're really intentionally thinking about diversifying the field and we're really interested in centering and in recruiting more African-American teachers and leaders, then we have to figure out a way to help think through the financial costs, the financial burden that it places onto them. We also think about the social political context in which Black teachers particularly have to work. And so they walk into spaces where the majority of the folks that they end up working with and who happen to hire them do not look like them at all. And so what does it look like now to be a Black leader that walks into a split space where the majority of the folks in there happen to be minority, but not African American? What does it feel like? And so from our perspective, a lot of our students have indicated that it is a daunting task to walk into a space and not feel possibly that you're connected to the community that's there. Some of our folks who come into our program also would like to work in spaces where they actually work with African-American youth. And as the demographics of the African-American population inside of Los Angeles County continues to decrease and across the state, there are increasingly lack of spaces for them to actually go back and give to the community that they actually wanted to come into, teach and lead to begin with. So what does it mean for us as preparation programs then to prepare them to work in spaces that may not suit what they came into the field to begin with, right? Or what does it mean to really be like a transformative leader in spaces where you may not actually be able to serve the exact students that you wanted to serve when you decided to come inside of the profession? All those things are important to think about when we think about recruitment of African-American teachers and leaders. And Dr. Young mentioned the post or the support that we provide African-American candidates post and during their time with us. Well, we think about it as pre, during, and post. And again, this just hits back on all of the research that was stated before. What are we doing as an institution of higher education to ensure that folks understand and are centered inside of our own programs? How are we doing this beforehand, before they end up going to or not even considering teaching as an option because of all of the barriers that are in place? What are we doing to eliminate those? The second piece of it is during. What do the programs look like? We make a concerted effort to make sure that not only do you walk into a space that the majority of the folks are people of color, but so are the instructors that you sit with inside of those spaces. So are the things that you read. So are the things that you think about tackling inside of those institutions, those programs. And then it's after. There have been many calls of our African-American candidates to ask for coaching after the fact because of the social political climate, because of everything that they deal with when they leave the program. And so what are we doing after the fact as an institution to help support the African American candidates once they leave and they get their admin credential and become teachers. And what does that look like? It's a tall order. And again, if we're interested in the recruitment and the pipeline, and not just recruiting folks, but actually having a transformative way to think about new thoughts and processes inside the field of leadership and education, we have to do something that's drastically different from the higher education and these programs that folks are entering for the teacher ed and their leadership programs as well. And so part of it, again, is thinking very strategically. One of the things that we really focus on is what do we really mean by recruitment? What does it look like? Is our mission and vision compelling? We've been working and thinking about that quite a lot. What makes African American future teachers and leaders want to come into our programs? What is so compelling to even get them there to begin with? And then again, thinking about how do they situate themselves, or how are we helping situate themselves when they actually enter into those programs? And all of those things are important if we're thinking about retention and the recruitment of our African American future leaders and teachers.
Thank you so much for your perspective as we look at our institutions of higher learning and their response to the pipeline, putting action behind it. Thank you for connecting all of those dots for us so eloquently, Dr. Orange. We're going to bring in all of our panelists at this point so we can have a conversation together. And as we bring our panelists in one by one, I am going to go back to our online audience. We have quite a bit of data to chew on. I'm sure your wheels are turning. I was over here, taking notes pretty seriously while I was listening to our presenters. I'm going to ask our audience to share your questions and comments. Keep them coming in. I've seen them coming through, and we've shared some of them via Facebook Live or YouTube. And we'll begin posing those questions to our panelists very soon. We're going to give you some time to begin that flow. Or I was in a training recently and they called it the Zoom waterfall. We're not on Zoom, but start that waterfall of questions coming through and comments coming through. We want to hear from you. This conversation is for you. This is grounding us in our 3-part series, and we definitely want those differing perspectives from all of our virtual audience. So the question that I want to pose to all of you, and thank you so much for such rich content for us to discuss, is where do you see the most immediate policy or practice opportunities when it comes to increasing the pipeline of Black educators? And when I say educators, I'm talking about both teachers and leaders. Together, we are educators on our local and state levels. So as you were sharing so many different aspects that contribute to this pipeline, there are lots of opportunities. And where do you see the most immediate ones that folks should be thinking about? We have people who are listening who are policymakers, people who are educational leaders, people who are in positions to make these types of calls. I want to hear what you all are thinking in terms of most immediate policy and practice opportunities. And any one of you can step in first.
I'm happy to step in. So we surveyed California teacher prep programs a couple of years ago, and one of the top barriers to enrollment that they cited was inadequate financial aid. So I think that's one immediate opportunity that we can address. And as I mentioned, there are a few ways to do that. One is service scholarships and loan forgiveness programs, and these address the challenge of cost by underwriting the cost of teacher preparation in exchange for a number of years of service, often in high-need subjects in schools. And research on loan forgiveness and service scholarship programs has found that these types of programs tend to be highly effective at recruiting individuals into teaching and directing them to the highest need fields and locations. Teacher residencies are another option. These are typically 1-year intensive apprenticeships modeled on medical residencies. And residents apprentice alongside an expert teacher in a high-need classroom for a full year while completing their credential. coursework, often a master's degree at a partnering university. And they typically receive a stipend and tuition assistance in exchange for a commitment to teach for 3 to 4 years after their residency. And residencies have also been found to attract a diverse candidate pool, which is, helps to supply that diverse candidate pool to high need fields. It's also important that state and district policies support teaching conditions, like has been mentioned, teaching conditions matter, that encourage teachers of color to continue teaching things like mentorship and ongoing support, professional learning for school administrators on how to nurture a supportive school environment for teachers of color, providing wraparound supports for students in order to reduce teacher burnout. So those are a few sort of immediate opportunities that come to mind for me.
Thank you. Others who'd like to respond to that?
I would just like to reiterate what Dr. Carver-Thomas just mentioned, that thinking about this really does need to be a kind of taking a comprehensive look at it. And those barriers that she mentioned are at a couple of different places in the pipeline. That is, the financial barriers, which Dr. Orange also spoke to, of getting the actual preparation, but then also having some debt relief would be really helpful, because so many people leave our schools of education with significant debt. And then, of course, the working conditions are really, really key. But this also comes back to the pipeline issue in general of, what is this profession that we're inviting these bright young people to come into? Are we inviting them into a place that is going to nurture them, that is going to pay them well, that is going to help them be fulfilled? Or are we inviting them into a profession that is going to blame them and mistreat them and basically deprofessionalize them? And I think that that's a really, really important question for us, because I want to create a profession, and I know my colleagues do as well, that is compelling and that is a place where you feel like you can have efficacy and make a big difference. And I'm not so sure that a lot of our young teachers and leaders who come into our field feel that way. And that's a shame. And if we're going to put into place some kind of a national strategy, and I think we should, about recruiting people into the teaching and leadership profession, we also have to think about how we create a profession that is going to support them and to support all of the kids in our schools at the same time. And that part of supporting them is, is the funding that we provide, it's the preparation we provide, it's the way that we support them as young professionals in their fields through networks and through mentoring and coaching. I feel like too often we try to just touch on here or make a tweak here and pull on this lever, when this is really, if the state of California, for example, were to really lean into this, they would take it systemically and they would say, okay, this is what the research says. This is what the patterns look like in the state of California. This is what we're going to do. And it's going to be from high school all the way into the field when the person has been a principal for several years.
Mm-hmm. And I really appreciate that, Dr. Young. It should be a national strategy to me and a statewide systematic strategy on how they think about this. This is nothing new. Teachers of color, particularly African Americans, it's been a space of walking into a profession that you do not feel efficacy, that you are not welcome into those spaces. And that has been well recorded since desegregation has taken place. Not since desegregation have folks walked into spaces where they feel that this is a profession that really welcomes them, right? And so if folks are really serious about it, it should be a statewide, to start off with, a systematic approach to think about this. And this just again highlights what happens after the place. and just thinking about the resources that we put in and some type of systematic approach to support African-American teachers and leaders once they leave, not just their traditional, your bits of program that they have to support new teachers, but real issues that really hit African-American teachers when they walk into a social political context inside of the state of California, where the numbers of African-American students are just dwindling down completely. Like, what does it mean to support those folks when they walk into hostile environments? What are we doing after? And again, not just our regular, teacher mentoring after they finish the programs, but really what are we doing to help sustain the teachers of color and our African-American folks to stay there to begin with. And that has to be thought through. And that is not being thought about at a statewide level or a national level.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to pull in some questions, and this is really great perspectives to hear. And I want to continue to push on that. What can we be doing from a statewide perspective? And I know that 209 has always been something that people talk about as a barrier to why things have not been called out in terms of race in the state of California, that disallowed affirmative action in the state. I want to dig into that a little bit. But I also wanted to get into one of these questions. But before I do that, before we lose that thread, what are thoughts around that whole Prop 209 argument that, we aren't having these discussions around race, and particularly around Black educators, because we can't call out race as it stands in the state of California? Does anyone have a thought or perspective on that they'd like to share?
I can jump in. So the Oregon State Legislature in 2017 established the Oregon Teachers Scholars Program, and it had the explicit purpose of increasing the diversity of the teacher workforce in Oregon. Scholars there are awarded $5,000 per year for up to 2 years and can use the money for educational expenses such as tuition and living costs. In California, we recently funded the Golden State Teacher Grant Program. However, this grant program in California does not target culturally and linguistically diverse students in teacher prep programs because we cannot legally do that. Prop 16, which is on the ballot now, offers an opportunity to repeal Prop 209, which would make it possible for our government to consider race, sex, ethnicity with programs like the Golden State Teacher Grant Program, similar to what other states are capable of doing.
Mm-hmm. I want to, and thank you for that. And I believe that there are, creative solutions that not necessarily get around Prop 209, but speak to the importance of having a racially diverse teacher and leader workforce. I've seen districts do that in a way that allows that for that to happen. I want to jump in on this question asked by Ms. Lee, which is, what approach can a person take in addressing this issue without accepting the narrative that this concern is more political than necessary for growth? Does anyone have a perspective on that?
I don't want to just speak because I want to make sure everyone else gets an opportunity,
Go ahead.
Okay. Addressing the issue without accepting the narrative that this coercion is more political than necessary for growth. I believe, and I don't know what the research says about this, so maybe some other folks on the panel can correct me if I'm saying something that's not research bound or based, but the concern, if I'm understanding the question correctly, the concern of talking about issues of race and understanding how they center themselves in the understanding of how we diversify our pipeline or what we do inside of programs and how to get folks to them. That narrative of it's more about diversity than it is about the systematic underpinnings of race, racism, white supremacy has always been there. That, to me, that narrative has always been there, that it's a political narrative and folks are making this political and not what the real issues are. I believe that if we looked at all of the research that was done around how Black leaders and Black teachers feel about how they're situated inside spaces, racism has always been a necessary thing to consider when we want to move and grow and do something different. It has never been an opposite narrative. So the narrative for other folks, because it makes them comfortable, is great to say that it's political, versus the folks who actually deal with it every single day and have to live it, understand that without having conversations, without understanding all of the issues around race and white supremacy and how that affects our teachers, how it affects our education system, how it affects the higher institutions who are training folks, it is a part of the narrative. And so the more institutions who are really working and organizations that are working to recruit and really hold folks of color and their thoughts in those spaces as the dominant narrative that goes on about how we should move, then I think the narrative eventually shifts. Mm-hmm. But without having those narratives be the front and the centers in the spaces, it's definitely difficult. It's easier for the narrative to be, it's a political, and it's not, why would we talk about these things? It doesn't help us grow the way we need to grow. I think the way we also think about it is that, again, it's not just about diversifying, it's about, and I think Dr. Young said this earlier, it's about what we're asking folks to do with the thoughts, why we need to diversify. It's not just because we need, the various points of views are important. So it's not just about the numbers, it's about the thoughts that are in there. And with more thoughts who understand and have a different perspective about how life is in educational systems around race and everything else, and white supremacy and all of those things, then those things come to the forefront. But it has to be intentional. And this just goes back to intentionality, like Dr. Young said. And folks have to be very intentional about it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Dr. Young, you want to get in on this one?
Yeah, I just wanted to just applaud Dr. Orange. That was just a really wonderful response. But and I would just add that I mean, another important way to make this not political is just to go back to the data. And research demonstrates, and I can't recall, somebody mentioned some of this before, it may have been Dr. Ridley Carr, the positive impact that a diverse pipeline of teachers and leaders have on student learning, on student retention, the impact that leaders of color have on developing a strong organizational culture for learning and for teacher success. So I think that people will push on kind of those political levers consistently, and it's important too that we just come back to the data, because there's quite a bit of data that suggests that having a diverse pipeline of teachers and leaders is important, not just to students of color, but to all students.
Mm-hmm. And as I think about this question of recruitment, Dr. Young, that you talked about earlier, and also hearing it in the earlier presentations around what needs to happen to diversify the teacher and leader pipeline, this question around recruitment practices came up, and I wanted to raise it to the group, because we have some folks who are directors of HR tuning in right now and having these questions around how can they have better or more effective recruitment practices. And I also think this applies to our folks who are tuning in institutions of higher education. The question comes from Natasha. Recruitment efforts will be huge in showing commitment to supporting Black educators in our pipeline, but what are the most effective recruitment practices that are authentic in their outreach?
I can speak to the principal recruitment and pipeline, but I don't know if one of my colleagues wants to speak to it in terms of teacher recruitment first.
Abby or Abby Ridley Kerr or Desiree Carver Thomas, would you like to speak to that?
Sure,
I think I would
happy to. Apologies.
Go ahead.
Go ahead first.
I would just reiterate that recruitment and retention are inextricably linked, that a lot of what we're seeing of the pipeline, at least nationally, is that more, like I said earlier, more Black teachers are coming into the field than ever before, but also have high retention or turnover rates that undermine those recruitment efforts. And so it's important not just to recruit more Black teachers, but really to think about recruiting teachers through high retention pathways where they are receiving the comprehensive preparation that they need to be successful in the field and want to continue to teach. I think that aside, or in addition to that, it's also important that recruitment efforts aren't tokenizing of people of color based on the research that we've looked at. That is certainly a possibility where you have people of color on your brochures, but not in positions of leadership or in positions where they have autonomy or influence in school decision making and so on.
Abby, would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, I would echo all of that and repeat again, they're inextricably linked together. I think you can't work on one without acknowledging and working on the other side as well. I would underscore the importance of funding, and obviously that's a barrier that we see with Prop 209, and so if that passes, that will be a huge opportunity and way to bring in some new revenue to support candidates who want to enter the profession but otherwise would not be able to. And on the retention side, I think it's important to go back to those practices that I mentioned that were identified by our national office. So how are we affirming folks in roles, and how are we making sure that they are well supported and able to sustain the work that they're doing in schools?
This next question comes from Alicia Montgomery, who leads the Center for Powerful Public Schools, a co-sponsor of this event today. And she asks, what are the critical issues for teacher and leader preparation programs to address in order to adequately prepare not only Black teachers and leaders, but district leaders who seek to support them? This came up earlier when we were talking about, I believe it was you, Dr. Orange, and also you, Dr. Young, around what happens once folks get in positions. And Abby talked about affirming and ensuring that people have an environment in which they can thrive and grow. But from your perspective, when we talk about teacher and leader preparation programs, how are we ensuring that the district leaders who want to support them, who want to keep them in the pipeline, understand how to do that? And before you respond, I also want to reach out to our virtual audience and tell them to keep those questions and comments coming. We appreciate those. All right. Dr. Young, do you want to lead us off?
Sure. I think it comes back to this issue of intentionality. And if you are intending to build a diverse pipeline of leaders who can support a diverse student population and the teachers that teach them, then your program content, curriculum, your extracurricular, and your field placements are also going to support intentionally those goals. And so your faculty is very likely to be much more diverse than a typical ed leadership preparation program. We find that the more successful programs are also offering their preparation in partnership with districts or other types of organizations that they're working with. And that provides an opportunity for additional diversity among the teaching staff as well, but then also for more reflection on the context in which these leaders will be eventually leading. Now, a second piece is a curriculum itself. You'll find curriculum that's much more focused on culturally responsive leadership practices, where you find that candidates are actually reflecting on their identity and what it means to their eventual practice as a leader and working with others, regardless of what their color is, so that they understand what those different types of interactions may be saying, even not explicitly. Another piece of it is the different types of placements that you have, and whether or not you are intentionally placing candidates with really high quality mentors who have a record of success in diverse schools, so that the candidates are not being prepared in white and affluent neighborhoods. Instead, you're placing them in places where they're going to have a much more diverse experience. And then also the types of requirements that you have for your candidates in terms of types of like capstone experience and so forth will much more likely be around advocacy issues, on education change that has some kind of an equity element to it.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to add one thing to Dr. Young's great list of what needs to be happening in preparation programs. And this speaks directly to district leaders who support folks once they leave those preparation programs. Mm-hmm. And it's thinking about, again, just this systematic and partnership, I think, with school districts about how the folks who end up supporting the folks that we end up putting into the field are able to do the exact same things or think about the same things that Dr. Young just meant, that they're able to also understand their identity and how it impacts the way they think about teaching and learning, that they also understand what African-American new teachers and principals need when they come into the field, so that they don't also, so they're actually perpetuating things that we don't want to be perpetuated, but they're actually helping teachers think about the system in itself and how to interrogate it, and even pushing more the narratives that haven't been told, but those absent narratives, that they're centered now in the work that they do with leaders, that they understand themselves around culturally linguistic responsive pedagogy and how to sustain, not only helping the new leaders and teachers understand how to sustain students' culture, but understanding how to sustain themselves when they're there. That how do I sustain who I am as an African-American leader and teacher in this system that seems to beat me down and I'm ready to get out? So what are we doing for helping the district folks who support leaders is extremely important. And that there needs to be some kind of, I don't know, systematic connection between district folks and how they think about preparing their district folks who support district leaders, to, again, the connection to how institutions are preparing our future candidates as well. Because often they walk out of the higher ed institutions and they receive all this, and then it becomes a disconnect as soon as they match up with the folks who are supposed to support them when they're in the field. So it needs a lot more focus there.
That is so important. That is incredibly important. And research has shown that sometimes when principals enter districts that are not supportive of them to be advocacy leaders or to make significant change on behalf of students, it's very, very difficult for them. Many times that's one of the reasons why they are not retained. So absolutely, that is so important.
Do we have examples of districts, school organizations that are doing that well? Are there bright spots out there? We have a question that is really hitting on that, but also around this introduction of implicit and explicit bias as UCs and CSUs. What's happening there? And Mina, who's joining us, saying that she doesn't recall having this in her own coursework until her EDD program. But are there examples of this anywhere, bright spots that we're hearing about, where district leaders are being prepared to support their Black teacher, leader of color, teacher of color pipeline coming in to ensure that they are retained?
It's a great question. I'm not aware of any, unfortunately.
I mean, I can just speak to, sorry,
Yeah,
go ahead. I'm sorry, Dr. McGowan, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, as we're speaking to some of the researchers who are watching us today, maybe this is a potential area for future research, identifying where these bright spots are, and if they don't exist, researching what actually would work. But Dr. Orange, if you had something to add, I certainly don't want to cut you off on that.
Well, I was just going to say, I know the Center for Powerful Public Schools, this has been something that they've been thinking about quite a bit, about how are we supporting and making connections between the folks who support our candidates, once the leaders, particularly when they go out into the field. What does it look like to support district leadership, to support our candidates in this work? So there's no research around that, but I do know they're taking that up quite a bit. I also, and I can only again speak for UCLA at this point, but UCLA has worked with their teacher ed program through their teacher residency program that they had and still have at UCLA Center X, that they have worked with the Los Angeles Unified School District in partnership to think about what does the transition look like once they come from our teacher ed program and they transition into the teaching field, and who supports them when they actually start to teach. And so what does that transition look like? So there have been a lot of meetings and the work that has been done between the two to say, let me tell you about what our philosophies and values and beliefs are, and why we do center race in what we talk about, and why we understand why implicit bias and bias have to be discussed, and it has to continue to be discussed as you move on and you support our candidates when they come out, because this is what they're used to talking about. And understanding again that it doesn't make you implicit bias or bias doesn't make you not do something that's still racist. So you have to continue to talk about it even after you're gone. And so those have been efforts that I know of particularly, and thinking about, again, where, like Dr. Young said, where our candidates are actually being placed and being very mindful of that. And we think about those all the time. So all of that support, I know those things are taking place and in the works. No research around that. So we'll see.
Well, I'm sure that's anticipated. Oh, go ahead.
I can speak to a research project that I'm working on at Learning Policy Institute, which is on the Racial Equity Leadership Network, which is an effort led by LPI, Southern Education Foundation, and National Equity Project, where we have cohorts of superintendents and district leaders, specifically in districts in the South, who are working together to advance racial equity in their districts. And they're looking at several domains, pulling different levers, one of which is around staff, supporting staff, and but there are other things as well. So that's an ongoing research project, and we don't have any publications around that yet, but certainly is an area of interest for us, and I think we'll be happy to share that research when it comes out.
I was also thinking that Meredith Honig has quite a bit of research on effective district practices, and she does have like a section among her framework that does look at this this issue of supporting equity. So I don't know if that could provide some insight. And then I saw Joe Johnson from the National Center for Urban School Transformation is somewhere in the audience, and I imagine that his center might also have some insight into this question.
Yeah, Joe, we'd love to hear from you if you want to drop a comment on Facebook Live or YouTube to help with this particular question. We'd love to hear your perspective as well. And as I'm thinking about, the increasing number of Black teachers coming in, but also exiting at the same time, there is a real opportunity here to find out what type of support is needed to plug this leaky pipeline. And if it's happening after I leave our programs and they're actually in the practitioner role, what is it that would be so supportive that these district leaders or charter leaders could be doing to adequately support them or better support them so that they remain. I wanted to raise this question from Carrie Huchting, and she talked about, in addition to higher education, Abby, you talked about in your beginning presentation around work happening in Compton and Poway districts. She wants to hear more about that work and what are they doing there that's working to address a diverse pipeline.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you have Dr. Travis Bristol coming as well, so he can absolutely speak to Compton in more detail upcoming, but happy to provide some more context there. That is a program specifically targeting male educators of color and building out and strengthening the pipeline there for those educators in district. Started at one middle school and has grown across district, is now in its third year, with the intention really of building out an affirming network of educators in the district where they can come together, usually on a monthly basis, to talk through practices, share stories, and really create a rich learning environment that supports them throughout their time at the district. And Poway, I would just again highlight obviously it's a starting point to put out a resolution and say we support recruiting and retaining educators of color, but I think it's a critical one to come out and publicly say and then commit to some goals and really start to push that conversation and examine some of those questions more strategically. So that's obviously new, but we're watching that and hopeful that it will have some impact on students.
Thank you, Abby. I want to get ready to wrap us up. If you can believe we are ending the time that we have together. And before we wrap up, and as I think about the group that we are forming with AXA and the Center for Powerful Public Schools, as we think about the goal of building a pipeline of teachers and leaders in the state of California, and through the various perspectives that you've shared with us today, for those who are committed to this work and specifically around this working group, policymakers, practitioners, and researchers, where should they begin when it comes to addressing this issue as a group in developing a comprehensive strategy to address this for Black educators in the state? And maybe we can start with you, Abby, and then from there we'll hear from Desiree Carver-Thomas, and then Dr. Orange, and then Dr. Young.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know I'm speaking to an audience of educators, but I would say start with your voices, start with your experiences, and use that to drive the conversation. These data points in this research is only as powerful as the collective stories and experiences that we know are true to educators across the state. So lead with that.
Thank you.
I would say that the state has actually been making significant investments in growing the teacher pipeline. The state has dedicated $300 million in funding over the past 3 years to a variety of programs. And of course, with the uncertainty brought on by COVID-19 and the pandemic and all of that, there are predictions of worsening shortages on the horizon. So it's really the time to build on the investments that have been made. A lot of those investments were one-time investments. So thinking about how can that infrastructure be built upon, and with that specific eye towards diversity, which not all of the programs have included.
I would say as we build on the infrastructure that's already been started, like was stated, that there's intentionality around the voices that are at that, that are in the conversation and making the shifts of what needs to be changed, that they're African American folks of diverse thoughts sitting there, and that the conversation is always centered around that. And that even as we move towards, even as folks think about what they bring in to start to change their programs or policies, that even the research that they think about is just always a critique of who's doing the research, why the research is done, whose voice is in there. And so that folks don't always remember to interrogate all of what is being said and being done as they move forward, and making sure that African-American folks are centered and in the work and are leading the work.
Well, I think that this conversation and conversations like this are really important, particularly right now, as Dr. Carver Thomas was mentioning. I mean, the state has already expressed a sincere interest in this topic. State Superintendent Thurmond, in fact, reiterated that when he spoke to a group of deans last week as part of the CTC conference. And that was being new to the state of California. I must say that that was just sort of music to my ears. I was really happy to hear that we have support from leadership at that level. I think that the conversation we've had today has demonstrated that this is a very complex issue, and that we really do have to take a comprehensive view of it. So if you have work groups that are thinking about this at those different levels, I think that would be a really wonderful approach, and they can use the beautiful stories that people bring to the table, as well as data, and getting a sense of what the California pipeline looks like what's happening to get kids into college and to get them into schools of education, to get a teaching degree. How are we then providing a really wonderful opportunity for these teachers to learn both the art and science of being an effective teacher, and then what are we doing to nourish them and to encourage them, tap them to become leaders someday themselves. And then, as we were talking about just towards the end, this whole notion of the supportive environment within the district. I mean, I think you could have work groups that are looking at any one of those things. And I would encourage you, since this is clearly right up DLI's alley, to try to foster those types of learning communities where we can then take a comprehensive package of what we think needs to be happening, to the state, or as Dr. Orange said, to the nation.
Thank you. Thank you all for your time and attention. I want to encourage our audience to continue this conversation in your districts, in your charter organizations, in your institutions of higher education, among your research colleagues, policymakers, wherever you are in the space of public education. We want to continue this conversation, and we also want to move toward action. We had some great ideas about how to do that from the research lens, from the practitioner lens. There's so many different perspectives, as Dr. Young talked about, that we come to this work. And so I invite you all to do that wherever you are. And I know that we're listening to folks who are listening to us are outside the state of California. I hope that this is giving you food for thought where you are, and continue to push and drive, because this is not only a very important conversation, but it's important for African American children. And so we do this work for the kids, and we want to see them centered, keep them centered in our work. And so with that, I want to thank our guests. I'm going to make a few announcements before we wrap up about the upcoming sessions for the next few weeks. And so with that, stay tuned. Next week, for part 2, we'll hear directly from leaders of teacher and administrator preparation programs. Guests will include Dr. Pedro Noguera from USC's Racier School of Education, Bahara Watson, who's the director of the Doctorate in Education program at California State University, Sacramento, Mr. Ernest Black, Dr. Ernest Black, who's the system-wide director for Cal State Teach, as well as Anna Marie Francois, who's the executive director for UCLA Center X and CTC commissioner, also the counterpart of Dr. Orange. I'd also like to offer one plug for the DLI Principal Fellowship Program. This program is designed for Black and Latinx aspiring rising principals, launching in the Bay Area in the fall of 21. And for more information about that, I encourage you to visit diversityandleadership.org. And also, if you are interested in participating in this working group, we will email all of our registered guests how to get involved, how to fill out the information form. Again, we thank you so much for your time and attention, and also for the great comments and questions that have come through YouTube and Facebook. We appreciate you. I also want to make sure that those comments that are being shared right now get shared more widely on the screen. Thank you, Michael. And yes, future email invites for other sessions will be shared. If you did not RSVP for this session, we will display one more time the link for you to RSVP so you can be included on subsequent information that we'll be distributing. Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate you joining us. Victoria, appreciate you joining us. Jonathan, thank you. And he says, thank you, leaders, for pushing us forward for our students and future and current leaders in education. Thank you all so much. And again, keep doing what you're doing for our students. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we will see you again next Monday.